The story begins with a number so staggering, so impossible to process, that even seasoned investigators froze in disbelief when they first arrived at the scene. 918 people, dead in a single day. Men, women, children, even infants, their bodies sprawled in concentric circles around a large open-air pavilion in the heart of the Guyanese jungle. It was November 18, 1978. The air was thick with humidity and the metallic sting of death. Soldiers and journalists who pushed their way through the tangled jungle brush described a silence unlike any they had ever heard, an eerie, suffocating stillness broken only by the buzzing of flies. What had once been a promise of paradise now resembled a battlefield after a war, except the enemy was nowhere to be seen. The enemy was an idea. Scattered across the muddy ground were small paper cups, some crushed beneath lifeless hands, others still upright, their rims stained with a sickly purple liquid. That liquid was laced with cyanide, mixed hastily with powdered grape drink flavor aid, not the Kool-Aid that would later become shorthand for blind obedience. It carried death into the veins of hundreds. Entire families lay collapsed together, their arms entwined in death, just as they had been in life. The sight was so overwhelming that hardened U.S. officials, who had seen the blood-soaked fields of Vietnam, would later confess they had never witnessed anything this grotesque. Rows upon rows of bodies, stacked like fallen dominoes, their eyes open but unseeing, staring up through the canopy of trees into a sky that gave no answers. This was not an earthquake, not a natural disaster, not an accident. This was orchestrated, planned, ordered, and at its center stood one man, Jim Jones, the self-proclaimed prophet who had once promised salvation and equality, but instead delivered the largest mass suicide in modern history. For decades after that day, the world would wrestle with one question. How could this have happened? How could a preacher from Indiana command such loyalty that nearly 1,000 people would willingly or unwillingly swallow poison at his word? To put it in perspective, imagine the scale. 918 people in one day. That's more than 3 times the number of victims in the Oklahoma City bombing. Nearly twice the death toll of 9/11's Flight 93, United 175, and American 77 combined. In fact, until September 11, 2001, the Jonestown Massacre represented the single largest loss of American civilian life in a non-natural disaster. And it didn't happen in the United States. It happened in an isolated jungle settlement, thousands of miles away from home, hidden under the thick green canopy of Guyana. No highways, no neighbors, no escape. Just the echo of a man's voice carried over loudspeakers, day and night, until his word became law. And his followers' lives were no longer their own. When the news broke, headlines screamed across the globe. Mass suicide in the jungle. But that headline only scratched the surface. Some had chosen death, yes, but others had resisted, only to be held down and injected with poison. Children had no choice at all. The tragedy was not simply suicide, it was a carefully staged execution of faith and fear. In the aftermath, families across America received phone calls. No parent, no sibling, no child should ever hear. Your daughter is gone. Your brother is gone. For some, entire family trees were wiped out in one night. Generations extinguished in the jungle soil of a foreign land. The world had to ask, who was Jim Jones? How did he build such devotion, such terrifying control? Why did hundreds leave behind everything they knew to follow him into exile? And what exactly pushed him to orchestrate the unthinkable? That is the story we're telling today. But be warned, this is not just history. This is a descent into obsession, control, and the darkest corners of human loyalty. If you're new here, subscribe to Chanel. This is the channel for those who dare to look at the shadows of history without flinching. Because today, we're going deep into the jungles of Guyana, into the heart of Jonestown, where salvation turned to horror and paradise became a graveyard. Before Jonestown became synonymous with horror, it began with a single man who believed he was destined for greatness. His name was James Warren Jones, born in 1931 in the small town of Crete, Indiana. 2 neighbors, he was an odd child, pale and intense, walking around town with a Bible in one hand and a fascination for death in the other. As a boy, Jim Jones held funerals for animals he found dead along the roadside. He preached to kids his age from makeshift pulpits, mimicking the fiery sermons he overheard at local churches. Even then, people noticed something about him. He could hold attention, command silence, and stir emotion. That charisma would become both his greatest weapon and the root of his followers' destruction. His childhood was marked by isolation and poverty. His father, a World War I veteran, was distant and sickly. His mother, overworked and weary, encouraged her son's ambitions, but never truly grounded him. In this vacuum, Jim Jones cultivated two obsessions: religion and power. He devoured scripture but also Marxist literature, blending the language of salvation with the rhetoric of revolution. In the 1950s, America was gripped by racial segregation and Cold War paranoia. Jones, sharp enough to read the cultural winds, carved out a unique identity for himself. A preacher who spoke openly about racial integration. In the heart of Indiana, this was dangerous. But for many black families who had been shunned and oppressed, Jim Jones's words felt like hope. He promised equality, a place where everyone could belong. He was also a master manipulator. In church services, Jones staged miraculous healing, slipping chicken livers into his mouth, pretending to vomit them out of sick parishioners as proof he had cured their cancer. The crowds gasped, applauded, and believed. Even skeptics found themselves swept away by the intensity of the performance. But beneath the promises of compassion was a man who craved control. Former members would later recall how Jones was obsessed with loyalty tests, requiring congregants to sign over their paychecks, their property, their very lives to his cause. He convinced them that giving up everything was a path to salvation. By the early 1960s, Jones had formally created the People's Temple, a church that was equal parts religious revival, political theater, and cult of personality. He built a following not just in Indiana but across the Midwest, then California. He courted politicians, aligning himself with progressive causes, racial justice, and even local mayors. Jones wasn't just a preacher anymore, he was a rising star. To outsiders, he was a crusader for equality. To insiders, he was becoming something else entirely. His sermons grew darker, laced with talk of conspiracies, enemies, and looming apocalypse. He told his congregation that America was on the brink of collapse, that nuclear war was imminent, and that only he could lead them to safety. Even then, hints of the nightmare to come were visible. Jones began practicing what he called loyalty drills, ordering followers to drink what he said was poison, only to reveal later it was harmless juice. He told them it was a test, a rehearsal for the day when enemies might come for them. These tests would evolve into the infamous White Nights at Jonestown. What made Jones truly dangerous was not only his charisma, but his contradictions. He was a man who preached compassion, while secretly abusing his followers. He denounced capitalism, yet lived in excess. He spoke of equality, while surrounding himself with enforcers and demanding sexual loyalty from women and men alike. And yet, thousands followed him. Why? Because he offered what many were desperate to hear in the turbulent 1960s and 70s. That there was a place where the poor, the marginalized, the forgotten could belong. He called himself their father. He told them the world outside was filled with hatred and enemies, but inside the temple, they would find safety, family, and purpose. By the time the world caught on to Jim Jones, it was too late. He had already perfected the art of devotion, already convinced his people that he alone held the key to survival. In his own words, "If you see me as your God, I'll be your God." That belief would drive hundreds to follow him, not just across America, but eventually across continents, into the thick jungle of Guyana, where paradise awaited. Or so they thought. The 1960s in America were turbulent years: civil rights marches, assassinations, protests against Vietnam, cities burning with unrest. It was a time when many people were searching desperately for answers, for a community, for someone who could explain the chaos and offer hope. Jim Jones understood this better than anyone, and he knew how to present himself as the answer. The People's Temple wasn't born as a cult. At first glance, it looked like a progressive church ahead of its time. Its doors were open to black and white members alike. Families struggling with poverty found food and shelter. People battling loneliness found belonging. Elderly members found care and dignity. For many, it was the first time in their lives that they felt truly seen. Jones positioned himself not just as a preacher but as a social crusader. His congregation ran soup kitchens, free medical clinics, even programs to help the homeless. Politicians and journalists praised his work, holding him up as a model of Christian charity in action. When civil rights leaders in California sought allies, Jones was there. When politicians needed votes, he delivered busloads of cheering supporters. On the surface, the temple was a beacon of hope. But behind the curtain, things were far more sinister. Jones wasn't satisfied with admiration, he wanted absolute loyalty. Members were required to hand over their paychecks, savings, even property deeds. He told them it was for the cause, for building a better future, Many complied, believing that sacrifice was holy. Those who hesitated were pressured, shamed, or threatened. Inside the temple walls, services became intense spectacles. Jones would thunder from the pulpit about equality and justice, but his voice was laced with paranoia. He spoke of government conspiracies, the FBI, the CIA, and assassins in the shadows. To his followers, the outside world was nothing but enemies waiting to destroy them. Only inside the temple could they be safe. He also engineered elaborate stagecraft to prove his powers. A woman crippled in a wheelchair would suddenly stand and walk after Jones healed her. Followers gasped and cried, their faith deepening with every performance. What they didn't know was that Jones often planted these miracles act as lies, illusions to strengthen his grip. Children were raised inside this atmosphere of devotion and fear. They were taught to call Jones father. He became the center of their world, their protector, their God. Families were slowly broken apart, with loyalty to Jones placed above loyalty to blood. Mothers were forced to give up authority over their children. Husbands and wives were pitted against each other. The temple was family, Jones insisted, and only he could be trusted. By the late 1960s, Jones's ambitions outgrew Indiana. He moved his growing congregation to California, first to Ukiah, then to San Francisco and Los Angeles. In California, his influence expanded dramatically. He courted the press, befriended celebrities, and even secured connections to political heavyweights. His rallies drew thousands. His followers handed over not only money but their very lives. Still, whispers of abuse spread. Former members described being beaten, humiliated, and subjected to bizarre punishments. Dissenters were dragged before the congregation, where Jones would order them beaten until they confessed loyalty again. Late-night meetings often lasted until dawn, leaving members too exhausted to question him. Sleep deprivation, fear, and constant repetition wore them down. Jones insisted these brutal measures were necessary because the world outside wanted to destroy them. Enemies are everywhere, he warned. If you leave, they will kill you. Only here, under my protection, are you safe. This was how idealism became fanaticism. What started as a mission for racial justice and equality had twisted into an empire of fear. Jim Jones wasn't simply a preacher anymore. He was becoming a dictator. And yet, the People's Temple continued to grow. Even as abuse mounted, thousands stayed. Why? Because the temple had swallowed their entire lives. Their money, their families, their homes all tied up in Jones's grip. To leave meant losing everything. To question him meant punishment. By the early 1970s, the People's Temple had become one of the most powerful religious movements in California. Jones had the adoration of thousands and the ear of politicians. But it wasn't enough. The whispers of corruption and abuse grew louder. Reporters began digging. Families of defectors began demanding answers. Jones, increasingly paranoid, believed it was only a matter of time before his empire came crashing down. So he began to dream of something radical, leaving America altogether. A utopia far away, hidden from scrutiny, where his control would be absolute. And that dream, soon, would have a name: Jonestown. By the mid-1970s, Jim Jones was running out of room to maneuver. His power in California was immense, thousands of followers. Political clout, headlines praising his racial progressivism. But the cracks were widening. Families of defectors began speaking out. Former members described beatings, sexual exploitation, financial coercion. The press was circling, hungry for scandal, and Jones, who had always balanced charisma with paranoia, began to spiral. He spoke more frequently of plots against the People's Temple, the CIA, the FBI, shadowy assassins. He saw enemies everywhere. His sermons, once filled with promises of utopia, now dripped with fear and apocalyptic visions. The world is dying, he warned. America is finished. They will come for us. The solution, in his mind, was simple: escape. Leave behind the scrutiny of America and build a new Eden in the jungles of South America. Somewhere remote, beyond the reach of reporters and courts. Somewhere he could reign without challenge. That place would be Guyana, a small, English-speaking nation on the northern coast of South America. Poor, socialist-leaning, and eager for foreign investment, Guyana seemed the perfect partner for Jones's dream. In 1974, the People's Temple signed a lease for 3,800 acres of land deep in the jungle. They called it the People's Temple Agricultural Project, but to his followers, it was already being whispered as Jonestown. To those left behind in the United States, Jones painted the move as noble. He told them Guyana was a socialist paradise, a land free of racism, where they could live in true equality. It's the promised land, he said. A place where we can finally be free. He showed photos of lush greenery, wide rivers, smiling villagers. He spoke of fresh fruit, abundant land, and the chance to build a perfect society from the ground up. For many of his followers, poor families, marginalized communities, people worn down by racism and poverty, the offer was irresistible. They would leave behind America's hatred and start again in a new land, hand in hand with their father. But the reality of Jonestown was far from paradise. Those who first arrived in 1974 found nothing but dense jungle and suffocating heat. Trees had to be cut by hand. Crops failed in the poor soil. Mosquitoes swarmed, spreading malaria. The so-called Promised Land quickly became a back-breaking labor camp. And when more and more members poured in from the U.S., the settlement grew crowded, supplies ran low, and tensions mounted. By 1977, as media scrutiny in California intensified, Jones made his decisive move. In the dead of night, he fled San Francisco with hundreds of followers, boarding planes bound for Guyana. By then, he was heavily addicted to barbiturates and amphetamines, his speech slurred, his paranoia deeper than ever. But to his people, he was still their father, their prophet, leading them into the jungle to fulfill a divine mission. When the new arrivals reached Jonestown, many wept. Not out of joy, but out of shock. Instead of the lush paradise Jones promised, they found cramped huts, sweltering heat, and armed guards at the perimeter. Food was scarce, medical supplies scarcer. And yet, no one dared speak against him. Those who voiced doubts were shamed publicly, or sent to the box, a small underground pit where dissenters were thrown as punishment. And slowly, Jones sealed off every path of escape. Passports were confiscated. Mail was censored. Armed guards, many loyal to him with a fanaticism equal to any soldier, patrolled the compound. Those who wanted to leave were told they couldn't. Jones preached that America was lost, that defectors would be captured, tortured, killed. Better to die here in dignity, he told them, than crawl back to that fascist hell. Jonestown was no longer a dream. It was a prison. Still, Jones spun the story differently. In propaganda films sent back to the U.S., Jonestown looked idyllic, children playing, lush gardens, happy workers singing songs of unity. Politicians and journalists were shown carefully staged tours, smiling faces rehearsed to say the right words. Behind the curtain, however, the people of Jonestown worked to exhaustion under a sweltering sun, eating meager rations of rice and beans, while Jones's voice boomed constantly over loudspeakers, filling the air with his rants and paranoia, day and night. To Jones, the Guyana move was more than escape, it was transformation. No longer just a preacher, he was now a head of state, a god-king ruling his people in isolation. But isolation breeds madness. And in Jonestown, madness was about to reach its breaking point. When the last wave of temple members finally arrived in Guyana, their dream of paradise collapsed the moment their feet hit the red mud. They had left behind homes, jobs, schools, entire lives in the United States, for what they thought would be utopia. Instead, they stepped into a place that felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. Daily life in Jonestown was grueling. From sunrise until nightfall, men and women toiled in the jungle heat, hacking at stubborn soil, planting crops that rarely thrived, hauling lumber, building huts, maintaining machinery. The food was scarce, a thin stew of rice, beans, and occasionally some vegetables. Meat was rare, fruit even rarer. For children, their playground was the mud and the mosquitoes. For the elderly, labor never stopped. There was no rest in paradise. But perhaps the most unbearable thing wasn't the hunger or the heat. It was the constant presence of Jim Jones's voice. Loudspeakers were mounted throughout the compound, blaring day and night. His words, often slurred by drugs, poured endlessly into every corner of Jonestown. He ranted about enemies plotting against them, about the CIA preparing to strike, about how defectors were traitors. He preached that Jonestown was the only safe place in the world, that leaving meant certain death. Sleep was nearly impossible without his voice echoing through the jungle canopy, weaving paranoia into every dream. Children were taught loyalty songs, reciting oaths of devotion to Jones as though he were their true father. Mothers were pressured to let Jones decide their children's fate. In Jonestown, family bonds were broken and reforged in his image. No child truly belonged to their parents anymore. They belonged to father. Discipline was harsh. Dissenters were humiliated in public meetings called catharsis sessions. Imagine a crowd of hundreds gathered under the pavilion, and one terrified member dragged before them, accused of betrayal. They were shouted at, sometimes beaten, until they confessed loyalty once more. The punishment for resisting was worse. Isolation in the box, a coffin-like hole in the ground, or being drugged into compliance. There was no privacy. Letters home were censored, monitored by Jones's trusted inner circle. No one could leave without permission. Armed guards, many young men with rifles slung across their backs, crawled the jungle's edge. Not to keep outsiders out, but to keep insiders in. Defection was painted as treason, punishable by death. Survivors would later recall the terrifying rehearsals known as White Nights. In these drills, Jones would gather the community late at night, sometimes waking them with alarms, and tell them enemies were closing in. He would order them to line up and drink from cups he said contained poison. Parents would feed it to their children first, then drink themselves. Only after the liquid passed their lips would he reveal it was harmless. It was a test, he claimed. A rehearsal. And each time, their fear grew, and their loyalty deepened, until the unthinkable no longer felt impossible. Behind the facade of communal harmony, Jones himself was unraveling. His health was failing. Years of drug abuse had left him paranoid, incoherent, often slumped in a chair, as aides propped him up to speak. But even in this weakened state, his control over Jonestown was absolute. His word was law. His followers, whether through fear, devotion, or exhaustion, obeyed, without question. For outsiders, the illusion persisted. Carefully staged propaganda videos showed smiling children, happy workers, lush gardens. Visiting journalists or diplomats were shown only what Jones allowed, guided along paths rehearsed in advance. Surrounded by loyalists who would say exactly what they had been told. To the world, Jonestown still looked like a bold social experiment, a model community deep in the jungle. But for those trapped inside, it was a nightmare wrapped in slogans of equality and salvation. They lived each day knowing they could never leave. They lived with the sound of Jones's voice, with the eyes of guards watching them, with the gnawing hunger in their stomachs. And they lived with the memory of those tests, where they had already tasted death on their tongues. It was only a matter of time before rehearsal became reality. By 1978, the mask of Jonestown was crumbling. What Jim Jones had once sold as paradise was now, visibly, undeniably, a prison camp. The rations were shrinking, the work was relentless, and the community was collapsing under the weight of exhaustion and fear. And Jones himself, the man who promised salvation, was unraveling before their eyes. He was no longer the fiery preacher of Indiana, or the polished political operator of San Francisco. Years of drug abuse had left him a shadow of that man, bloated, pale, his eyes glassy, his speech often rambling and incoherent. Barbiturates dulled his nerves. Amphetamines wound him into manic tirades. Sometimes he slurred through entire sermons, barely able to sit upright. But still, his voice blasted across the loudspeakers of Jonestown, 24 hours a day. The followers, who once saw him as a savior, now whispered about his decline. But whispers were dangerous. Anyone caught doubting Father was dragged before the congregation and humiliated in public catharsis sessions. Those who resisted were thrown into the punishment hole or sedated into compliance. Outside the jungle, pressure was mounting. Families of Jonestown members in the United States were sounding alarms. They wrote letters, pleaded with congressmen, begged the State Department for help. They described their loved ones as captives in a foreign land, held against their will, stripped of communication, and trapped in an armed compound. The press picked up their stories. Defectors who had escaped Jonestown told of forced labor, hunger, psychological abuse, and the chilling suicide rehearsals. Suddenly, the illusion Jones had built that Jonestown was a utopia of racial harmony and communal living was under siege. Jones's paranoia skyrocketed. He told his followers that the US government wanted to destroy them, that planes were coming to bomb the settlement, that assassins lurked in the jungle. He played tapes of gunfire and sirens over the loudspeakers at night to convince his people that enemies were near. He spoke of death not as tragedy, but as liberation, a revolutionary act against a world that hated them. His health and paranoia made him increasingly violent. Armed guards were stationed throughout the camp. Jones began stockpiling weapons. Children were drilled to prepare for invasions that never came. For the followers, reality blurred. Were they safe in Jonestown, or prisoners of it? Were they defending themselves from enemies, or simply feeding their leaders' delusion? By mid-1978, cracks in the community were undeniable. Some members risked everything to slip notes into the hands of visiting journalists, begging for rescue. Others secretly plotted escape through the jungle, though most never made it. Those who were caught faced brutal punishment. Parents were told that if they tried to flee, their children would suffer. Fear kept them tethered. And in the midst of all this, Jones grew more obsessed with the idea of revolutionary suicide. He spoke of it as a noble alternative to surrender, a way of defying the so-called fascists who would supposedly destroy them. His rhetoric hardened. We didn't come here to live long. We came here to die for what we believe in. It was a chilling preparation for what was to come. The walls were closing in. Families in America were demanding action. The press was circling. U.S. officials were forced to pay attention. And in November of 1978, one man decided to go see for himself. His name was Congressman Leo Ryan. He would step into the heart of Jonestown with the courage to face what so many feared, and he would never make it out alive. In the fall of 1978, Congressman Leo Ryan of California made a decision that would seal his fate. Ryan was no stranger to danger. He had once gone undercover in Folsom Prison to investigate conditions firsthand, and he believed in seeing the truth with his own eyes. When desperate families of Jonestown members begged him for help, he agreed to go to Guyana, to step into the heart of Jim Jones's jungle fortress, and find out what was really happening. On November 14, 1978, Ryan and his delegation arrived in Georgetown, the capital of Guyana. His group included reporters, photographers, lawyers, and concerned relatives of Jonestown members. Jones knew they were coming. Word had reached him long before, and paranoia gripped the settlement. He ordered his followers to prepare, rehearsing answers, staging scenes of harmony. Once again, Jonestown would try to play the part of paradise. When Ryan's group finally arrived at Jonestown on November 17th, they were greeted with rehearsed smiles and rehearsed speeches. Children sang songs about unity. Members praised their father. Tour guides led Ryan and the press through freshly painted huts, lush gardens, and cheerful workers. Cameras clicked. On the surface, it looked idyllic. But beneath the surface, cracks appeared. During a press conference inside Jonestown, a man slipped Ryan a note. It was hastily scrawled, "Help us get out of Jonestown." Others began to quietly approach Ryan's aides, begging for escape. Fear hung in the air. The smiles were masks. That night, Ryan and his delegation were allowed to stay in Jonestown. Over dinner, Jones gave a rambling speech about persecution, enemies, and the noble cause of his community. His voice was slurred, his tone uneven. The reporters noticed his decline. The followers noticed too, but no one dared question it aloud. By the next morning, the cracks had widened into a fissure. More temple members came forward, quietly telling Ryan they wanted to leave. Mothers begged him to take their children. Jones's loyalists grew restless, glaring at defectors, whispering threats. The air was heavy with tension. When Ryan finally stood before the people of Jonestown and announced that anyone who wished to leave was free to go with him, the illusion shattered. Around 15 members stepped forward. For them, this was the moment of truth, the chance to escape the jungle prison. But for Jones, it was betrayal, the ultimate humiliation, and he could not let it stand. Ryan and his group gathered the defectors and prepared to leave. But as they boarded the truck to the Port Kaituma airstrip, loyalists followed, their faces grim, their eyes filled with fury. Among them was Larry Layton, a temple member who volunteered to accompany the defectors. No one realized he was armed. At the airstrip, chaos erupted. Just as the delegation began boarding to small planes, a tractor rolled up, carrying armed temple gunmen. They opened fire without warning. Reporters scrambled for cover. Defectors screamed. Congressman Ryan was shot multiple times, collapsing to the ground. NBC reporter Don Harris, photographer Greg Robinson, cameraman Bob Brown, and temple defector Patricia Parks were also killed. Others lay wounded in the dirt, bleeding, begging for help that would not come. It was a massacre, the first assassination of a sitting U.S. congressman in the line of duty. And it was the spark that lit the final, horrific act of Jonestown. Back at the settlement, Jim Jones gathered his followers. The congressman was dead. The government would come for them. And in his twisted logic, there was only one way out: death. He called for a white night unlike any before, not a rehearsal, not a drill. This time, the poison would be real. Back at Jonestown, the news of Congressman Ryan's death traveled fast. The airstrip was 20 miles away, but Jim Jones already knew what had happened. His gunmen had carried out the order. A U.S. congressman had been murdered. Journalists executed in cold blood. There was no turning back now. Jones assembled his people in the open-air pavilion. Loudspeakers crackled through the humid night, calling every man, woman, and child to gather. Survivors would later describe the scene as surreal. Nearly 1,000 people shuffling into the pavilion under the canopy of jungle. The torches burning, the shadows long. The mood was heavy, confused, tinged with dread. They knew something irreversible had begun. Jim Jones sat slouched in a wooden chair at the front, a microphone in his hand. His voice, once booming and charismatic, was now cracked and weary. Drugs slowed, but insistent. He told them the congressman's death meant the U.S. government would never forgive them. Soldiers would parachute into the jungle, torture their children, destroy their community. They won't leave us in peace, he said. The time has come. The time, he explained, was for what he called revolutionary suicide. He framed it not as surrender, but as defiance. Death, he said, would be their victory over a cruel and unjust world. Barrels of grape-flavored, drink laced with cyanide, Valium, and chloral hydrate were brought forward. Mothers with infants were the first called. Nurses filled plastic syringes and squirted the liquid into babies' mouths. Screams filled the pavilion as the poison took hold. Some parents resisted, sobbing, begging to spare their children, but Jones's enforcers stood ready with rifles and needles. Resistance was futile. Eyewitnesses who survived by hiding in the jungle recalled the horror. Rows of children convulsing, mothers wailing, Jones urging calm through the microphone. "Stop this hysterics," he barked. "Die with dignity. Don't be afraid of dying." His voice was cold, practical, as though he were leading a ceremony instead of mass murder. Adults lined up next. Cups were handed out. Some drank willingly, believing Jones's words, convinced that death was salvation. Others hesitated, but under the watchful eyes of armed guards, they raised the cups to their lips. Within minutes, they collapsed, muscles seized, breathing slowed, eyes glassed over. The pavilion floor was soon covered with blood. The recording of that night, the infamous death tape, captures the chilling sound of chaos. Children crying, mothers screaming, Jones insisting it was all for the best. At one point, he urged, "Don't be afraid to die. Death is just stepping over into another plane. It's all we were ever meant to do." Some tried to run, they were chased down and injected with poison. Others begged for mercy, but none came. And so the nightmare unfolded, in waves first, the children, then the mothers, then the men. Entire families perished together, arms wrapped around one another as the poison consumed them. The jungle, alive with insect hum and night sounds, became a graveyard of silence. At the end, Jim Jones himself did not drink. A gunshot rang out. When soldiers later entered Jonestown, they found him slumped on his throne-like chair, a single bullet wound to the head. Whether self-inflicted or fired by one of his aides, no one knows for certain. By dawn, 918 people lay dead. 300 of them were children. It was the largest single loss of American civilian life in a deliberate act. Until September 11, 2001, Jonestown was no longer a community. It was a mass grave. When the first Guyanese soldiers hacked their way through the thick jungle and entered Jonestown, they were not prepared for what they found. At first, they thought the colorful sprawl before them was a mass of people lying in sleep. But as they stepped closer, the truth revealed itself in horrifying detail. Bodies, hundreds of them, sprawled in rows, some face down in the mud, others clutched together in final embraces. Infants lay still in their mothers' arms, their lips stained purple from the poisoned drink. The sight was overwhelming. Even hardened soldiers covered their faces and turned away. The stench of death hung thick in the humid air. The buzzing of flies drowned out the jungle's natural chorus. It was a vision so grotesque, so surreal, that the world would struggle to believe it without photographic proof. And that proof would soon cover the front pages of newspapers around the globe. When news broke on November 19, 1978, headlines screamed of the horror. Mass suicide in Guyana, but the full scale wasn't understood at first. Initial reports suggested a few hundred dead. As the days passed, the numbers grew higher and higher. 400, 600, 800 until the staggering final count emerged. 918 lives lost. The world was in shock. For Americans, Jonestown felt like a national trauma. Until that point, nothing of this scale had ever occurred outside of wartime. Nearly 1,000 U.S. citizens dead in a single day. Not by enemy attack, but by the command of a preacher they once trusted. Families across the country were devastated. Entire households had been wiped out. Mothers, fathers, children, grandparents, all gone. The bodies were flown back to the United States in waves, loaded into military planes. Many were so decomposed from the tropical heat that identification was impossible. For relatives, Grief was compounded by confusion. How had their loved ones been convinced to follow Jim Jones to such an end? How could ordinary Americans, teachers, nurses, students, elderly become part of what looked like a ritual suicide on foreign soil? The political fallout was swift. Questions swirled around how Jim Jones had gained so much influence, how politicians in San Francisco had courted his support, how state officials had overlooked the warning signs. Congressman Leo Ryan was dead, assassinated in the line of duty, the first U.S. congressman ever killed while serving. His murder shocked Washington into realizing the scope of Jones's madness. The media dissected every angle. Television programs played footage of Jonestown taken just days before the massacre, showing smiling children, singing choirs, lush gardens. The contrast between those images and the grim reality of cyanide-stained corpses was unbearable. Late-night comedians and cartoonists coined the phrase, "drinking the Kool-Aid," a cruel shorthand that reduced a national tragedy to a punchline. The phrase would outlive the event itself, twisted into slang for blind loyalty. Even as families mourned the real human cost, survivors emerged, those who had slipped into the jungle during the chaos, or been away on errands that day, or simply lucky enough to avoid the pavilion. Their testimonies painted the true picture. It was not simply mass suicide, but murder. Children were forced, resistors were injected. Armed guards ensured no one left. For many, there was no choice at all. In the weeks that followed, America asked itself hard questions about cults, brainwashing, and the vulnerabilities of the human spirit. Could it happen again? How had Jim Jones, a man who once preached compassion, become the architect of mass death? And how could nearly 1,000 people follow him into the grave? The photographs haunted the nation. Rows of bodies in the mud, mothers still cradling babies. The bloated corpse of Jim Jones himself, sprawled in the pavilion. These images would burn themselves into collective memory, as much a warning as a horror. Jonestown was not just an event. It was a wound, a scar on history. And America, reeling from the shock, realized that the story was far from over, because Jonestown was not only about the dead, it was about the living, and the questions that still demanded answers. In the years after Jonestown, the name itself became shorthand for blind obedience, for cult devotion gone horrifically wrong. The word carried with it not just the memory of 918 lives lost, but the uncomfortable truth about human vulnerability. Jonestown was not about faceless strangers, it was about neighbors, co-workers, classmates, entire families who once laughed, dreamed, and hoped just like anyone else. For scholars, psychologists, and survivors, the central question has always been, how? How did ordinary people, many of them educated, compassionate, and socially aware, follow a man into the jungle, and ultimately into their graves? The answer was complex. Jim Jones did not take broken people and manipulate them. He took hopeful people, people who wanted a better world, who sought equality, community, purpose. He promised them paradise, and little by little, he twisted that dream into a nightmare. Jonestown became a case study in coercive control. Experts dissected the techniques: isolation from the outside world, sleep deprivation, the constant voice of authority blaring from loudspeakers, the rehearsals for death. By stripping away independence, by making every moment of life dependent on his approval, Jones turned followers into captives, long before the poison was poured. The legacy of Jonestown echoed far beyond Guyana. In the 1990s, when Heaven's Gate members donned matching uniforms and committed mass suicide in California, the headlines once again invoked Jonestown. When federal agents laid siege to Waco in 1993, people warned of another Jonestown. The cautionary tale had become a lens through which America viewed every new fringe movement, every preacher promising salvation in exchange for loyalty. And yet, the lesson of Jonestown was not just about cults. It was about power, persuasion, and the human desire to belong. It was about how fear, hope, and loyalty can be weaponized by a single voice. Survivors have spent decades trying to remind the world. The victims of Jonestown were not fools. They were people trapped in a system designed to break them, led by a man who believed his delusions were destiny. Even now, more than 4 decades later, the images remain haunting. Rows of bodies in the mud, children with purple-stained lips, a jungle pavilion turned into a massed grave, and the voice of Jim Jones echoing on the deathtape.com, persuasive, assuring his people that death was not defeat, but the final act of loyalty. But perhaps the most unsettling part of Jonestown's legacy is the question it leaves us with. Could it happen again? In a world still filled with charismatic leaders, with echo chambers and isolated communities, with promises of utopia and fear of enemies. Are we truly safe from another Jim Jones? That question is what keeps Jonestown alive in history's darkest memory. It is not just a story about 1978. It is a warning, a reminder that the line between hope and horror can be crossed quietly, gradually, until it is too late to turn back. And so we end here, in the silence of that Guyanese jungle, where the echoes of 918 voices still seem to linger, a paradise promised, a nightmare delivered, and a scar that will never fade. What do you think? Were the people of Jonestown victims of manipulation, or did they make their own final choice? And more chillingly, could something like this happen again in our world today? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to keep exploring the shadows of history, subscribe to Chanel, because here, we confront the stories most would rather forget.